Okay, here we go with Chapter 17, Section 2, Lesson. Section 2, Lesson, which is on the early years of the war. Right there. Okay, so we're going to explain how the Union responded to defeats in the East in 1862, and then we're going to evaluate the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, um, early on in the Civil War, um, the South actually was doing better. Uh, the Confederacy was more successful than the Union, but in the long run, it's going to be the Union that is going to be more successful because they have more supplies, uh, and it's just better overall. But we'll get into that later. So early on in um, the war was on land and at sea. In 1861, the Union blockaded Confederate ports. The South defeated the North in the First Battle of Bull Run. So there's the First Battle of Bull Run, and then the Second Battle of Bull Run is later. This happened in the summer of 1861. 30,000 Union troops were commanded by General Irvin McDowell. Irvin McDowell attacked a smaller Confederate force led by General P.T.G. Beauregard. It took place in Northern Virginia. Hundreds of spectators from Washington, D.C. watched the battle from a few miles away. Bull Run is actually a river in Virginia. A lot of the sides didn't have experience, really. The Union, they're called the Yankees. They weren't really used to it. And then the South, the Rebels, relied more on General Thomas Jackson. And his nickname will be Stonewall Jackson. If you've ever seen, what is it, Anchorman, I think. The ghost of Stonewall Jackson makes an appearance. Anyway, that's off track. But they called him that because he always liked to hold his position like a stone wall. The Union will be attacked by a counterattack from the Confederates, and this will force the Union to retreat, fleeing in panic. Okay, the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor. Okay, so CSS is Confederate States, USS is United States. Battled in a draw in March of 1862 when the Confederacy tried to break the Union blockade. These were known as ironclad because that's what they were made of, was iron. It was a wood ship covered in iron. March 8th, 1862, the Virginia attacked Union ships at Chesapeake Bay. That's up by Massachusetts. The Union shells just bounced off its sides. Some Union leaders feared that the Virginia would destroy the Navy, so they went up the river, and then it would go up the river and then eventually hit Washington, D.C. Chesapeake Bay is in Virginia. Holy cow. But this time the North had its own ironclad, the Monitor, rushed southward to face Virginia. They met in battle. Neither side won, but this raised the spirits of the people to do more fighting. April 1862, the South had lost the Battle of Shiloh, control of New Orleans, and the ability to use the Mississippi to carry goods to sea. Okay, so April 1862, that's a year in. The Battle of Shiloh was General Grant was the leader of the North. He was headed towards a major railroad junction in Mississippi. The Union camped out at Pittsburgh Landing, which was 20 miles north from where they wanted to go, near Shiloh Church. General Grant was also banking on getting some help from some other Union troops who were in Nashville at the time. What happened is the Confederate leaders decided to strike before more troops could get there to help the Union. Um, they were led by. They had a surprise attack. The battle lasted 2 days. It was a narrow victory for the Union, but the losses were enormous. Together, the two armies suffered more than 23,000 casualties, which includes people killed, wounded, captured, or missing. After this, the Confederates were forced to withdraw. The Union would take the town on May 30th. Memphis, Tennessee fell to the Union on June 6th, and then now they control the Mississippi River. Okay, this is all big, important stuff because this was basically how the South was getting all their supplies. And in the South, their railroad system is not as developed as in the North. So when you cut off one railroad, that's pretty major to certain parts of this country. So they did that, and then with New Orleans, that was an important port. And so to take control of that, now they're getting even less supplies. So the Union was slowly trying to cut off the Confederacy from the rest of the world, basically. Okay, so there's just a picture of a depiction of what a battle would look like. That's the Union on the left, the Confederates on the right. That would be one of the ships. This is the other one right there. One's I think I'm not even sure which. Oh, this one. Okay, that's the CSS. So this one is on the left is the Union one, the Monitor, and this one up here is the Virginia. So, okay. Alright, so now we're going to talk about Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, he attended the West Point Military Academy and graduated in 1843. So he went to the military academy. He became a second lieutenant to the 4th U.S. Infantry and was stationed near St. Louis, Missouri. He fought in the Mexican War and showed bravery and heroism that earned him position as a first lieutenant. Basically, Mexican War was with Mexico and the Spanish just trying to get Texas and some of those other states down there. In 1854, Grant actually resigned from the Army. He didn't want to do it anymore. He had fought his war, won his battles, showed he had proven himself, so he was done. At the beginning of the Civil War, Grant helped prepare troops and accompanied them to Springfield, Illinois. So he was just like a recruiter, okay, a drill instructor, drill sergeant, whatever you want to say. Then Illinois Governor Richard Yates offered Grant an aide position. And from there, Grant was quickly promoted to colonel and then to brigadier general. So he was out of it. Then he kind of slowly worked his way back up through the ranks until he got all the way up to general. February 16th, 1862, he won his first major victory for the Union. Confederate troops surrendered at Fort Donelson in Tennessee. So Grant, he was kind of farther west than the rest of the Union soldiers or brigades or whatever you want to say. He was west in all his fighting compared to Ambrose and Burnside, who were more east, and then Sherman is in the south. Confederate General Simon Buckner asked Grant in terms of surrender. Grant replied he would not accept anything less than unconditional surrender. From that point on, many believed Grant's initials stood for unconditional surrender because his initials are, his first name's Ulysses, and then his middle name is S. So Ulysses S. Grant. So they thought the U.S. was unconditional surrender, and that's what his nickname was, Unconditional Surrender Grant. And that'll be true when the Confederates finally surrender. When Grant is there and he makes Lee surrender, it will be an unconditional surrender. So, and there's Ulysses S. Grant right there, future president. One of the most I mean, absolute hero for what he did in the Civil War. One of the most corrupt presidents in United States history. Okay, now the war in the East. Under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, okay, he's kind of the big one, and then Stonewall Jackson, Southern forces were more successful in the East than in the West. This also kind of contributes to the generals in the East were not as good as Grant was. Lee invaded Union territory in Maryland, so the war would go deeper into the North. The thing was is that most of this fighting had been taking place in the South so far. In the South, their strategy was, well, okay, if we lost the West, the Mississippi, then the next thing to do is to go north and try to take D.C. because Maryland is a border state, and that's also where Washington, D.C. is. So if you can get Maryland and Virginia and have a lot of conflict going on there and work your way north, that will bring it closer to the Union and farther away from the Confederacy. So that was their plan. The Battle of Antietam ensued. This is the single deadliest day of fighting in the war. Now, it's not the deadliest battle. That belongs to Gettysburg, but Gettysburg was a couple days. Antietam is the single deadliest day of fighting in the Civil War. The North bested the South, gaining a key victory. So when they won Antietam, that was kind of a turning point a little bit in some of the fighting that was going on. But we're still not quite to the key turning points, but we're getting there. All right, so let's see. That is Jackson. That's Stonewall Jackson. And this is some of the fighting. Okay, you got McClellan too, and Sumner. Got all these guys. So the red there, that's the Confederacy. The blue is this is Battle of Antietam. The blue is the Union. Now, what's interesting is history is always written by the victors. A lot of the battles from the Civil War are named after rivers or like buildings that are next to the battle. If you would look at Confederate records, the battles are named after cities that are close. So this is known as the Battle of Antietam because that's the river there, the creek. But if you go to the south, it would actually be the Battle of Sharpsburg. Anyway, Lee, he was the big guy in charge. McClellan was the other one. McClellan, he wasn't too bad of a general. Burnside, he's okay when he's with other people, but he eventually gets fired. And then Sumner was another decent one that was fighting. But anyway, you can see kind of the plans and how a battle map actually looks. So. Okay, now Robert E. Lee here excelled in his education at West Point and graduated second in his class in 1829, so he is older than Grant. He transferred to the cavalry after experiencing slow advancement in the engineering corps. So he was trying to be an engineer, but that was too slow, so he just went straight to the cavalry. He demonstrated brilliance and heroism in the Mexican War as a captain for General Winfield Scott. So he was also involved in this battle, or in this war, and showed that he was a good leader as well. So kind of similar storylines there. 1859, Lee succeeded in suppressing the slave insurrection attempted by John Brown at Harper's Ferry. That's a pretty, that's an important battle or an important event in Southern history. It's not talked about so much now, but if you live down south, this is an event that's definitely talked about. Lee was offered the opportunity to lead a new army being formed of forces that seceded states to return to the Union. When Lee's home state of Virginia decided to secede, he resigned and went to Virginia to fight for the Confederacy. So originally, he was going to be put in charge of leading an army to punish these states. Then Virginia secedes, and he changes his mind and is the leader of the Confederacy. He gets hired by Jefferson Davis, who is the Confederate president of the South. All right, so there's Robert E. Lee right there. He was older than Grant was at this time. All right, the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the last thing here. So the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln first viewed the Civil War as a battle to save the Union. He hated slavery, but he did not want to oppose border states. So really what he was trying to do, the Civil War, it's not all about slavery. I don't know how many people don't understand that. The Civil War actually is more about states' rights, is a big one, okay? And then just trying to make peace with everything. The slavery works its way in eventually, okay? Not initially, but when things start to escalate, then it becomes a problem. Now, abolitionists, those are people who are opposed to slavery. Frederick Douglass was a big leader. He's pretty famous. Horace Greeley, another one. Both urged Lincoln to abolish slavery. That means get rid of. Lincoln officially freed the slaves and rebel-held territory on January 1st, 1863, but it took some time for all enslaved people to gain their freedom. So in January of 1863, he tries to do this. He officially says that everyone is free. Then they try to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the years after that, 1864, 1865. 1866, towards the end of the war. And basically those three amendments are, the first one is no more slavery. The second one is you can't, or you can vote, doesn't matter what your skin color is. And then the other one is citizen. Anyone that's born in the U.S. is a citizen. Doesn't matter what skin color you have. Okay, so that's that. I really encourage you. I would encourage you to read the Emancipation Proclamation. It's it's not too long, and it's really good just to see what Lincoln's message was about all this stuff. So, anyway, hopefully this explains kind of the beginnings of what was happening. The South early on was doing okay. It was a pretty back and forth battle, war, I mean. But there's going to be some changing points at a couple of key victories by the North. There's two battles that will be the turning point, and then what happens in Georgia is also pretty big. So anyway, that's the next few sections here. So.